Hey everyone, I am back. It's been a while. I took some time, but back to the grind now with Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought, which I don't know why I haven't covered this by now, but, better late than never. This episode is going to cover up to chapter 5, and then the next episode is going to cover all the way from chapter 5 to the end. Now, given the length of the book, these episodes might be a little longer than my normal ones, but I'm sure that's not a problem. Support and stuff, look at links in the description. Let's jump into it. No need for more intro. Starting with part 1. Let me just say one more thing. This book was written in 1990 originally, but if you read it, chances are you're going to read a version that came out later in the late 90s. And I don't know when the latest version was, if it was in the 2000s. And this is important to highlight because Collins is going to be responding to a number of people in the abridged, newer versions of this book that she hadn't discussed in the first edition. So if you read only the first one, chances are I might make reference to things that you're going to be a little confused about, but in any case, just so you know. All right, starting with part 1, the social construction of Black feminist thought. And chapter 1, the politics of Black feminist thought. So Black women have been systematically silenced or really erased throughout American history and throughout much global history, which is something we're going to talk about a lot, is in the resonances between the experiences of Black women in the United States and Black women all over the world, because it turns out that anti-Black, anti-women, racism and sexism permeates through a lot of different places, in a lot of different places. Collins starts with kind of reflecting on the words of Maria Stewart, who spoke about and organized for abolition and women's rights. And throughout this book, Hill Collins is going to make reference to a number of different feminist activists and thinkers who I can't describe in all the detail they deserve, because that would take forever. You definitely have to read this book and also go and read the people I recommend and that Hill Collins invokes, like Maria Stewart. We're going to talk about Zora Neale Houston, Lorraine Hansberry, Angela Davis. I mean, the list goes on and on, some of whom I've covered on this channel, but not enough, because I haven't covered enough Black thinkers, which is really a stain on my reputation. Now, to return to Maria Stewart, Collins highlights the ways in which Maria Stewart adopted the tenets of the American dream, including, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and simply applied them to Black folks, which shouldn't be a radical thing. It's quite simple, actually. This is something that Aimé Césaire does a little bit, and many other critical race and other, anti-Eurocentric thinkers who've just applied the very standards that Europeans and Eurocentric thought set forth and applied them to people against whom these ideas have often been used to oppress. And when doing that, it turns out that these ideas don't really speak for themselves or stand alone. Ideas like life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, it turns out, aren't inalienable, universal ideals that apply to everyone. It turns out they were actually only meant to apply to white people and the descendants of Europeans. So someone like Maria Stewart could just apply this very basic standard to the experiences of Black people, saying that they deserve the same rights as white people, and that wasn't taken very seriously. She was just ignored. Now, the suppression of Black women's voices and actions is not only meant to stifle their ability to organize, but also to erase Black women's suffering and make it seem as though they've consented to their suffering, which, to explain in other words, the idea here is that the suppression of Black women's contributions throughout the civil rights struggle, throughout abolition, throughout many other struggles, not limited to those, this effort has been done not only to stifle the possibility of future organizing, but to recast history in such a way as to make it seem as though these women were consenting to their situation, where if their voices have been silenced and erased in history, the conclusion that readers of history will come away from that is to say, oh, well, they must not have been suffering very much, which of course is the furthest thing from the truth. But this is why, maintaining histories that actually capture the experiences of people is important. This is what history is. And as we will go on and we look into things like Black feminist epistemology, and we question things like what history really means, we see that the very conception of history, which is often offered as this neutral thing, it's just about looking at the past, turns out not to be neutral at all. I mean, you open up any history textbook that you're offered in the West, and you find out that the things you learn about and the people you learn about are overwhelmingly rich white people. Are they the stand-in for what history is? Absolutely not. They didn't have the biggest effect, even in most cases. That would be like the working classes and the enslaved classes that were people who were effectively that drove production and to create entire countries. But those histories are erased in favor of histories that naturalize the existence of rich, powerful white people. So as enslaved people and the descendants of enslaved people, Black women endure economic, political, ideological oppression. And we can further elaborate by saying that economic oppression for Black women has historically looked like the denial of Black women economic flexibility, denying Black women opportunities to earn money, to acquire anything resembling property or any kind of financial comfort. This has been historically and systematically denied to the majority of Black women throughout American history. Now, politically, Black women have been alienated and disenfranchised. I mean, they earned the right to the vote in the 1960s, about 100 years after Black men earned the right to vote, about 40 years after white women earned the right to vote, signaling that the experience of being a Black woman is a different kind of oppression than that experienced by Black men and that experienced by white women. If you want more on this and specifically intersectionality, go and read Kimberly Crenshaw's Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, which I've covered on this channel if you want to listen to that. I am never a replacement for these ideas, obviously. Really, you got to read the stuff. But if you don't have time or for whatever reason, you can listen to me talk about it. And then on top of economic and political alienation and disenfranchisement, Black women have to endure many other ideological types of oppressions. The ways in which that they are stereotyped against, the negative images that circulate and ideas that circulate within the social body about Black women, that circulate about Black women from even Black men, which is something that needs to be considered, especially when considering Black feminist thought means accounting for the ways in which Black men participate in similar patriarchal trends and affordances that white men and white women can benefit from. Of course, it's not the exact same, but it's really important to still keep that idea present. And to add, of course, Black men have endured unspeakable horrors at the hands of white supremacy, at the hands of so many different violent forces throughout American, Canadian, Western history. And likewise, so too do white women experience oppression. These are very real experiences of oppression. However, when the ways in which people's oppressions are understood in terms of either race or gender, what that means is that anybody who experiences many of those kinds of oppressions is going to have to pick a lane, so to speak. Where historically it's actually been difficult for Black women to find a home in either the civil rights movement, and I'm being very general here, like obviously it's more complicated than that, but just to give broad brushstrokes for the time being, have struggled to find a voice in the civil rights movement and struggled to find a voice in the feminist movement. And that is because the civil rights movement largely overrepresented men's experiences, had men as the figureheads, had men as the speakers, etc. Whereas within feminist circles, you had white women taking on most of those roles as the organizers, as the leaders, as the speakers. And so with that, we see that Black women, as Black women, are effectively erased and denied a place at the table. So the kinds of experiences of oppression that they experience is not purely at the hands of white men. It is also in spaces that prioritize Black men's experiences and those spaces that prioritize white women's experiences. Now, in the case of feminism, which is kind of what we're after here today with this book, Black women have struggled really to demonstrate to white women that their experiences are as valid, as pressing, and as in need of organization as white women's struggles. Where one of the really problematic elements of the history of feminism in its popular manifestations, that includes its political, economic, corporate, academic manifestations, what they have done is normalized the investigation of the experiences of white women. And these don't map on to the experiences of Black women. Historically, white women have enjoyed a lot more financial privilege and possibility compared to Black women. White women have had access to property, have had access to generational wealth in ways that Black women have fundamentally have not. Black women have en masse been formed into a class of people responsible for taking care of the homes and families of the relatively privileged white women. Now, all these cases reveal that these are not the same situations. What Black women endure is very different than white women. Now, feminism is, by virtue of that, needs to account for these different experiences, but it historically has not. And so actually, there are many Black feminists who don't really identify with feminism as a result. They identify with womanism, which we'll talk about a little bit. They might not identify with that either. They might identify with a Black radical tradition that has earlier roots in matriarchal societal formations from Western Africa. You know, it can take on a number of different forms, not to mention the very nature of Black women's struggles is going to be different if we're talking about a Black woman in Louisiana versus a Black woman in Vermont today or 100 years ago versus a Black woman in Brazil, in Venezuela, in Uganda. You know, these are all going to take on different forms. And part of the challenge, and we'll look at this in the next episode and the second half of the book, is how you can reconcile these experiences into the recognition of a common struggle while respecting that these struggles are not ever going to totally map onto one another. Now, within civil rights circles, Black women have endured a lot of criticism for distracting away from what is taken to be the more pressing project, and that is to end racism, where if Black women raise the point that Black men can participate in patriarchy, Black men have historically sometimes construed this as meaning that Black women are muddying the waters or complicating the broader struggle against white supremacy and against racism, which I always find really interesting. And we see this play out today in the ways in which considerations for Black women's specific experiences are taken by certain Marxist circles as being a way to distract from the true project of opposing class society, of opposing capitalist exploitation. And I always find it really interesting the ways in which activism is the kinds of certain kinds of activism and organization and political struggles are normalized, and they have big projects. Overthrowing capitalism isn't a big project, but then there's absolutely zero bandwidth to consider anything else, to consider the experiences of Black women, to consider the experiences of other gender minorities, to consider people of different sexual orientations. Then it's too much. Then we've muddied the waters too much. But this grandiose project of global revolution, that's very much possible. It's very head scratchy to me. Actually, no, both of these things can happen at the same time. So Black men responded, not overall, but there were quite a few negative responses to Alice Walker's The Color Purple for not painting men in the best light or centering instead women's experiences, which with Black men they aren't always good. In fact, they can be quite abusive and can be quite violent. Or there's so many different cases like this. If you read even Patricia Hill Collins, so a few years ago I covered Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic on this channel, and the book is very good and you should definitely go and read it. But in it, and I find him intolerable for this, but at the beginning of the book, he's like, yeah, you have these black feminists like Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw and whatever. And they just kind of essentialize the existence of this unitary, stagnant, unchanging black feminist subject, this black woman subject. And he's like, this ends up recasting the Eurocentric ideas about identity onto these people. And he's like, it's for that reason that I'm going to go back to Hegel. Like, and I'm not exaggerating. This is like kind of what he says, almost verbatim. And I'm not joking. And I'm like, so you have a lot more problem with black women feminists than you do with Hegel, the guy who justifies like enslavement, or just says that within the Lord Bondsman paradigm that it is the bondsman or the quote-unquote slave in some translations that is opened up to more possibility by virtue of their not having been duped by the demon of contentment, of satisfaction, I should say, not contentment, of satisfaction. Like, isn't that wild? Like, this is something that Frantz Fanon can't tolerate Hegel for, but Paul Gilroy has absolutely no problem with him being like, I have all these problems with black women, they should probably read more Hegel. Like, what? But this is exactly what happens here with black women. Black women are under intense scrutiny all the time. Like, in order for them to be heard at all within these spaces, they have to essentially speak the language of those spaces, which in academic circles means speaking the language of the history of European philosophy. And all this does is end up just revitalizing Eurocentric ideals in these spaces and setting them as the benchmark, as the kind of point of entry for anybody wanting to do anything else, which it puts a restraint on what people can think and what new ideas that they can offer. And it must also appear in the standardized ways. Like, knowledge has to be transmitted through written words. It has to go through peer review. It has to then be published, etc., etc. Whereas for black women who've been historically denied the opportunities to contribute to that kind of knowledge or those spaces, not to say they need to, but because they're confronting that, because they definitely could, but they've been historically denied that, they've been forced to adopt different ways to transmit knowledge, to develop their own knowledges of their own experiences, their own understandings of the world, their own philosophies, their own knowledge systems, etc. And the ways that they've done this has come out in many different ways. It's come out in poetry and quilt making, in food, in their cuisine, and music. There's a very long, fascinating history of black women blues players and jazz players who have used these avenues to express their own experiences with their own struggles that are their own and speak to their communities. But these aren't the kinds of media, these aren't the kinds of avenues that will then be taken very seriously within academic circles, because they don't fit the right kind of processes to be taken seriously and be given the stamp of reputability. Now, the history of enslavement and segregation, it forced black people into so many different negative parts geographically of American society, forced them into ghettos where they would develop unique knowledge systems partly informed by West African cosmologies, Christianity, urban life, their own histories of oppression, which would then transform in a lot of these places with deindustrialization. So in the 1980s, when the United States, in its endless quest for profit, started to send many of its companies overseas, it meant that many uneducated workers were losing jobs because their jobs that they could be hired for were suddenly not available to them anymore, which contributed greatly to Black Americans being impoverished in the United States. And there's so many other factors, over policing. There's so much to really unpack, but all of these contributed to Black people kind of forced into these spaces, developing their own knowledge systems, their own ways of understanding the world that are no less legitimate than any other knowledge system, but because they don't adopt the right kind of academically, politically, socially reputable methods, they are therefore then discarded, discounted, not taken seriously in ways that other knowledge systems are. And on top of that, they were having to wrestle with the ways in which these reputable sites of knowledge production, like in academia, were continually producing and reproducing images of Black people that followed extremely oppressive stereotypes. And we'll get into them in more detail, specifically those against Black women. But this is what Black women would be fighting against. And they were going against this in an ideological way. They're fighting against it in academia, but they were largely trying to develop a self-identity that opposed the hegemonic creation of an identity for them, the imposition of an identity upon them that follows and borrows from histories of enslavement and oppression that they've had to endure in the United States for hundreds of years. So, for example, the idea that Black women are strong, physically stronger than white women, they're tougher, they can endure more. All of these contribute to a historically racist idea of Black women that goes all the way back to enslavement. And this actually undermines some of the other foundational assumptions that guide Eurocentric thinking, like that women are fragile and delicate, need to be taken gently. And with this is shown that actually that is a total myth. And it turns out that these are actual constructions that come about through the confluence of certain factors, like being given the proper material conditions through wealth, political power, etc., to allow you to embrace this kind of identity, and that this so-called biological characteristic fades away as soon as these material conditions aren't met, revealing that these are not biological traits or part of an essential female identity, but instead have to do with racism, have to do with the material conditions that permit people to live certain lives in certain ways, disrupting these Eurocentric notions of what gender is. So we can think here of Sojourner Truth's great speech called Ain't I a Woman, in which she says essentially this. She's like, aren't I a woman even though I am able to work in the fields, even though I'm not, helped across the street by those polite young white men? Like, aren't I still a woman by virtue of your conception of what a woman is? Yet I'm not bestowed all these privileges. And so she uses this to welcome these people to reflect upon their own ideas about what gender is and how racial oppression actually comes to influence what they know to be essential biological characteristics of women. Turns out these things aren't really essential or natural at all. So Black women's struggles is largely a struggle for reclaiming a self-identity that is not one that's imposed on them, and reclaiming ways in which to create and deliver knowledge in ways that oppose the standardized, reputable academic ways. Because in those spaces, Black struggles gravitate towards those of Black men, whereas women's struggles gravitate towards those of white women. Black women don't have much of a historical presence in these institutions. Of course, these things are changing for the better. In part, I don't want to be too optimistic here, but they have not had a historical place there to offer their own experiences and to develop in a way that actually reflects the lived experiences of Black women all across the world, because that would require women all across the world participating in this. It can't just emerge from one department in one school in the US, but it needs to be a wide, broad thing to bring these different knowledge systems, these epistemologies into the fold, and to allow that to be taken up as a reputable site of knowledge production, a legitimate way to understand these sets of experiences as legitimate as people today still study, like Plato or Socrates, whatever, like studying any of these other people that are just, it's the standard if you want to study philosophy. You aren't studying W.E.B. Du Bois, even a Black man, in an intro to philosophy class. Like, you might be, maybe you would, but it's not, chances are it won't be the first person you read. And why? Isn't it as valid as what anyone before had to say. It's really quite bizarre how we choose to continually retell these stories and to retell these histories as being part of a professional and academic canon. What constitutes philosophy, what constitutes sociology, what constitutes science or history, whatever. So the path forward would require really an expansion of these knowledge systems, their adaptation into academic spaces, but not just there, because of course we know this institution likely can't be saved. As Audre Lorde asks, can the master's tools really dismantle the master's house? Is there a way to redeem academia? I mean, this is a big question. I'm feeling less and less hopeful with every day that goes by. But in any case, it would demand this kind of expansive, multivariate approach that would consider Black women not as a singular homogenous group, but as a very, dynamic one, even within any given town. Like, not all Black women have the exact same experiences, let alone from state to state, from country to country. And Hill Collins invokes Audre Lorde's work specifically on Black lesbians. I mean, even among Black women, when you consider religion, when you consider class, when you consider sexual orientation, all these things are going to reveal different identities, different experiences, different sets of experiences that, both are connected to the overall experiences of the oppression of Black women, but endure their own kinds of specificities that shouldn't be ignored or just treated and absorbed into the view that there's just one homogenous universal struggle. That puts us here into Chapter 2, Distinguishing Features of Black Feminist Thought. Now, in the 1990s, critical race studies was often charged with falling prey to essentialism for trying to describe a Black or woman experience. And this was all the rage in the 90s when there was like a little blip of like post-structuralist influence in these spaces. Everyone was so excited about reminding Black people that there's no such thing as a race or anything like that, which was just another way through which white supremacy was able to naturalize itself and for whiteness to evade examination once more. Because if a race is taken as a just a construct or something like that, then white folks are able to continue benefiting from these systems while obscuring the ways in which they are able to benefit off of the labor of people of color, off of their continued exploitation, while claiming as though there's no such thing called race. But you just have to look at the facts, we could look at the data, to see that there are these recurring influences, these patterns that unite all Black women in a similar struggle. And that is that Black women tend to, on average, receive less money, receive fewer promotions, receive fewer job opportunities in a wide array of fields than compared to white women, compared to Black men, compared to white men, of course. These are facts. Now, of course, we should always maintain and not fall into the trap of essentialism. That would not be the way to do this. There's, of course, a lot of validity, I think, to recognizing mutual experiences of oppression as they can be easily also verified. Not to say they need to be verified through these academic Eurocentric methods. It's just a little assistance. It shouldn't be the only metric by which to assess these things. But even using these Eurocentric methods, we find that they're irrefutable. I mean, you cannot ignore these histories of disenfranchisement of Black women. So to bypass this, she draws from standpoint theory to think about Black women's specific standpoint and their collective standpoint in their experiences of oppression, while we're still respecting, of course, that standpoint is going to have many, many standpoints. Like if you're a Black lesbian woman, if you're a Black Muslim woman, I mean, these are going to be different, of course, but they can speak to this broader experience of being a Black woman. Now, commonalities here can be observed globally in the barriers to Black girls acquiring education, acquiring access to reproductive knowledge and healthcare, being denied access to political power across the world, being denied access to wealth, to any kind of economic opportunity, acquiring access to housing that is their own, not just through a husband or something. Like, these are common experiences and that unite all Black women, regardless of their different nations, nationalities, languages, religions, etc. Now, all of this should reveal that Black feminist thought is never really just about thought. It is focused very much on lived experiences of Black women. It doesn't try to apply some kind of a universal standard or try to develop one universal standard that it could then use as a test against which to measure the validity of anyone's claims to anything. It instead starts with the lived experiences, like, as the starting point, and from there tries to elucidate their connections to broader struggles. The old, like, second wave feminist mantra thing, like the personal is political, which is to say that anything that someone experiences is never just something they're experiencing alone. It's likely something that many people are experiencing, and it's only when that knowledge is raised that suddenly what one person may have felt to be an individual thing they were experiencing, they can see that this is actually a wider issue that demands wider solutions, that demands political solutions, that demands collective solutions. Now, this hasn't always been the case, though. Even among Black feminist thinkers, especially the academic ones, their words, albeit extremely important, have not always spoken on behalf, have not really captured the actual lived experiences of the majority of Black women. That is because throughout much of U.S. history, the few Black women who've had the privilege to go into academia, to go to, even go to grad school or whatever, these were women that in a lot of cases came from upper to middle class backgrounds, which means that, of course, they had a mutual experience of oppression, but maybe not one that was readily, like, very similar to those of enslaved or lower class black women. And so this shows that it's nothing against them. It has everything to do with the ways in which academia, as a site of knowledge production and transmission, is limited. It speaks to upper middle class people. It invites and brings in upper middle class people and allows those people to then speak on behalf of the rest of the population. This is a structural problem with academia. So that, there's nothing against Ida B. Wells or Anna Cooper, Mary Terrell, etc. I mean, their work is cannot be discounted. But it's important to interrogate the ways in which their perspectives don't necessarily fully capture the wide spectrum of different Black women's experiences or those of the majority. Like Black women workers, but after, ostensibly after enslavement, Black women workers had different avenues to do this kind of knowledge production and transmission, like with labor organizing, community events, Black women music, like with the blues and jazz. And it's important to recognize that these women are no less intellectuals or academics than those within academia proper. They are as valid and as legitimate in contributing to the reservoir of Black women's knowledge. Also, it's important to interrogate the ways that popular spaces that have permitted Black women to share their experiences have historically done so in a way as to present a very rosy image. And part of the struggle for Black women has been, as we mentioned before, has been to oppose hegemonic images and ideas and stereotypes about them, but it's also to inject within what is often a positive history a lot of the negativity and the bad emotions that are often Black women are encouraged to suppress or to put away despite all that they've endured. And we think of the example of the smiling Aunt Jemima, on the bottle, the woman acting as essentially working in the homes of rich, wealthy white people is super happy about it. Or there's the case of Uncle Remus, if anyone's seen the Disney movie Song of the South, where essentially this movie depicts a plantation where there's this kind of main character, Uncle Remus, who's a super happy slave. That is the image that Disney wants to give about what life was like under enslavement, which totally obscures the reality of life under enslavement, obviously, and sells this history as being one that was positive, that Black people responded well to, and this normalizes these types of relations and normalizes this history. So reclaiming this history means reclaiming the negativity within it. Negativity insofar as capturing the angry emotions and the bad emotions and the resentful ones and those moments that were violent and brutal and oppressive, not to hide them away. Now, to speak more about the distinction between womanism and feminism, I mean, this is something that Alice Walker wrote The Color Purple, came up with, or was really committed to, and that is womanism within the Black feminist tradition or Black women's tradition places more of an emphasis upon family, upon marital connection, not necessarily on the battle between men and women. And this is like somewhat of a common thing across some oppressed groups, is that there aren't the same kinds of conflicts between genders as there can be seen among white folks in some settings. And that's important to hold on to, because feminism, especially as it is applied against Muslim people, for example, will look at those settings and be like, wow, look at how oppressive this is. But of course, that's not an experience that's actually held by, or a feeling that's held by women in those settings. Rather, it is imposed on those women. Where right now, in the case of justifying Israel's relentless slaughter and assault of Palestinians, feminists, they've kind of, I don't know what they're saying about it right now, but have historically been like, oh, well, don't you think this is a better outcome than being oppressed by Muslims, Muslim men? And there's that great quote from Gayatri Spivak where she's essentially says that the project of like European Enlightenment has been, at least one of its elements has been, to liberate brown women from brown men. But what this is to do is to map on an oppressive sexist dynamic found within the West onto other settings where that dynamic doesn't exist in those ways. Hence Alice Walker's appreciation of the term womanism over feminism, because it doesn't recast that same kind of gendered conflict. Like, that gendered conflict may still be there, but it's not the same as the one that has been theorized by white women about their experiences with white men. Not to mention that Black women have been historically denied the opportunity to be seen as feminine. They've been cast instead as closer to men, and even in the racist conceptions being closer to animals, and not embracing the qualities that white feminism have understood of women and what women endure as a product of their being cast as fragile or delicate or anything related to that. And that puts us here into part 2, but chapter 3. So part 2 titled Core Themes of Black Feminist Thought, and chapter 3 titled Work, Family, and Black Women's Oppression. Now, for all of American history, Black women have been exploited, like, in general, en masse. Like, this has been well documented. Now, during enslavement, Black women would have to complete both the domestic tasks and field work, like working in the fields. This is something that Angela Davis writes about a fair amount, and Angela Davis writes about this to trace the racist and sexist ways in which Black women are viewed hegemonically within the U.S. as being too tough to be feminine. And Angela Davis traces this back to the ways in which, under enslavement, traditional gender binaries were not in play, because women were expected to perform all of men's duties or similar duties as men and also all the domestic duties. So for them, there was that kind of like blending between the two that Angela Davis writes about a lot, that is really worth reading about. And then following enslavement, if we believe that there was a date in which enslavement actually ended, following enslavement, Black women were then systematically relegated to underpaid and often really tedious, difficult work, working in unsafe conditions, working with unsafe chemicals, or relegated to jobs that other people didn't want to do. And on top of all this, black women have to take on a disproportionate amount of unpaid and unrecognized labor when it comes to caring for their families, caring for their extended families, caring for their partner's extended families. Like this falls disproportionately upon women in general. This is definitely a common thing to recognize. But in the case of black women, really disproportionately so, to an extreme extent, while also not being able to afford help in the ways that white women have sometimes been able to acquire. So then when black folks struggle, they're essentially blamed for it. Like they didn't work hard enough, or they didn't make the right decisions, and it is their fault for being poor or for not having access to generational wealth. Or if black women or black men see that their, life is not better for them if they start a family, then they're seen as being deviant. Then they're seen as being there's something wrong with them, of them going against the grain of proper American family values. Because black family dynamics they don't always look the exact same as white notions of the family, white ideas of the family. Because for black folks, and this goes back to enslavement for Patricia Hill Collins, she identifies the ways in which black women were enduring like so many different hardships, from having their children taken from them and then having to raise other children who were bought into slavery, into enslavement, and they had to take on so many different tasks and duties, and would require more community support from other women, from other girls a lot of the time, to help with these child rearing. And all of this contributed to the formation of different kinds of family dynamics, not to mention those that may have come from their ancestral lineage in certain West African contexts. Like in some cases, they could be polygamous. In some cases, they could be matriarchal. They could take on a bunch of different formations, and these histories would have some kind of an influence on these people. Now, the idea of the American nuclear family is extremely important to white supremacist America in that it maintains a high point of entry for a family unit that is recognized in the government's eyes, in businesses' eyes, in kind of the social eye. And by doing that, what it effectively does is it makes access into the upper echelons of American society contingent upon one's wealth, one's access to, at this point, because owning property depends on one's access to generational wealth, which have been systematically denied to black folks. So of course, their notions and the ways in which family will look for them is not going to be the exact same. But then if they don't properly adopt the American standard of what a family looks like, then they are going to be chastised, then they're going to be criticized, they're going to be blamed for their struggles. So this kind of separation would play itself out in so many different cases, where segregation following enslavement would work to maintain the separation between black and white people, whereas other factors and other kinds of oppressive dynamics would maintain the distinction and the separation between black men and black women, like economic factors that would give men more economic opportunities than women, forcing black women into just a narrow set of possible jobs. Also making black women way more economically dependent upon black men, if they're in a relationship with them, to provide for them, making them that much more precarious if the relationship doesn't work out. Or is what would happen in like the 70s and 80s when so many jobs started to disappear and black men were forced into more unreliable work, perhaps even illegal work at times. They would then be, it would be that much riskier for black women to be able to provide for themselves and their children if there was no longer that steady source of income coming from the gendered organization of labor. Now, during enslavement, black women were really relegated and had to do kind of one of two broad tasks. They'd be doing field work and domestic work. And with the ending of enslavement, with the process of urbanization, as more black people started to move into cities, their job opportunities started to expand, but the same dynamics still played themselves out, where black women would perhaps have their own apartments, but they'd still be working in white people's homes, or they would be working at front desks, or they would be working as nurses, if that. Jobs that, again, a very narrow supply of possible jobs that maintained the kind of legacy of historical racism and enslavement, but in ways that became more difficult to identify them. And this is, I think, a very important Marxist point about the way in which the ending of enslavement and the entering of Black people into the wage economy system, where they're no longer exploited as enslaved people, but as wage workers, what that did very effectively is it concealed the ways in which racism still very much functions in that space. But because there is the illusion of choice, where these people are choosing to choose whatever job they're doing, then it seems as though those racist dynamics aren't at play anymore. And this is why, it's very important to recognize the ways in which economic relations and exploitation follow legacies of racism and appropriate them. Now, of course, these jobs were extremely unsafe a lot of the time, especially working in the homes of white people, where Black women would be really subject to a lot of different kinds of abuse, of violence, from white homeowners, and they had no labor union to go to. They had no support networks that were politically oriented that would help them out. They couldn't call the police. They weren't on their side. And so Black women had to develop different spaces to have community, to have spaces to share, to understand each other's experiences, to find these commonalities. One of the ones that Patricia Hill Collins highlights is on the bus. We're taking the bus in the morning on the way to work. Many Black women would be together, and it'd be one of the only times when they were together, able to talk among themselves in ways where they weren't being immediately watched by the people they were working for. And so they had to be creative in finding these spaces and ways to share these experiences and to develop community and knowledge to understand their situations and to understand what is common about them. And so this classist dimension and economic exploitation would really, it would even play a part within the civil rights movement that, as it is popularly understood, didn't take on the class dimension in quite the way that, Patricia Hill Collins certainly wishes it would have, but in ways that would have accounted for how class dimensions maintain these legacies of racist oppression. Now, you can find examples of Martin Luther King Jr. really talking about this and making this very clear, that the fight against racism is a fight against capitalism, and I would say vice versa as well. But this is not how, of course, he's popularly remembered. Remembering ending segregation is something that is still accepted as an important contribution of the civil rights movement, while these other efforts, really championed by people like Martin Luther King Jr., by Malcolm X, by Baldwin and others, they were identifying as well the ways in which class society is maintaining and is really benefiting from these legacies of racial oppression, which is, if that is not taken seriously, then dealing with anti-Black racism in the United States might mean that just a new kind of race-based oppression is going to sprout out somewhere else, as was seen with the ending of the civil rights movement. What would happen shortly after that within deindustrialization was suddenly working populations no longer in the U.S. that were mostly Black people, in a lot of cases the most exploited. Suddenly these jobs would go over to Asian nations, where women would be exploited in Bangladesh, in China, in India. And it's there where we see the kind of this transferring of race-based economic oppression onto these other people. And if that's not accounted for, it only risks kicking the can down the road and placing this oppression onto a different group with each successive improvement, so to speak. And we'll talk about this more in the next part toward the end of the book. But even as Black women started to acquire more lucrative job opportunities in management positions, there's a well-documented phenomenon of companies hiring Black women or other people of color to take control of the laborers that are mostly people of color. It's like a way by which to introduce someone of the people you're exploiting to help facilitate their exploitation. There's also the case of Black women being hired on to companies right before the company is about to go bankrupt, or when they have to do like mass layoffs and they just get this person who they don't like to do all that undesirable work. Like, these are all well-documented phenomena. But they would need to, like, Black women, when they started to enter these positions, they would have to be taking on these really difficult jobs. In short, they would be acting as a kind of institutional punching bags to do all the undesirable labor. Not to mention, and then when they go home, they're likely still taking on most of the domestic labor, like making sure the kids are fed, making sure that the house is clean, all this very important stuff that keeps the world spinning. And that puts us here into Chapter 4, Mammies, Matriarchs, and Other Controlling Images. And here she'll talk about various stereotypes that really haunted Black women since enslavement. So Black women, they've really been subject to many negative stereotypes that operate to naturalize and normalize racism, sexism, and classism as it is directed toward them. And now much of the time this was done to liken Black women to animals, or to degender them, or to hypergender them if it's convenient, as they were viewed, in the case of animals, viewed as being mules, very much associated with workhorses under enslavement. Now, the quote-unquote mammy stereotype depicts the happy, domestic working Black woman who very happily gives up her time with her own children, with her own families, to happily go and work for a wealthy white family. And she becomes an important part of the white children's childhoods, and they have these good memories of their Black mammy that worked for them. But of course, that is a total illusion. Like, the woman is not doing that happily, giving up time with her own children to spend time here. But this image helps to normalize this relation and to make it seem as though these women happily entered these fields. They were happily doing this kind of exploited work. So this normalized Black women as domestic servants, while normalizing white women as those career-oriented go-getters in their quest for self-realization in their own feminist project. Which is why, like, when studying the history of feminism, this is one of the unsatisfactory things about the ways in which it's properly understood as first, second, and third wave feminism, where second wave feminism often tells the story of women deciding they wanted to start working, they wanted to escape from the home. But it turns out this hasn't been the story of all women. That was the story of some white women, whereas for Black women, they were always working. They could always find work. It was just within a very narrow set of jobs where they were hyper exploited. They didn't have the same kind of history of being alienated in the home, having too much time in these big homes, and the kids are at school and not knowing what to do with themselves. Like, that's a very different history than that of Black women in general. Now, besides the image of the Black mammy, there's also the image of the Black matriarch, where Black women are depicted as these overbearing, over-disciplinary mothers who just want to control their children, who are incapable of joy and fun, and they essentially become a matriarchal figure in the home, where they have more power than the father figure. And a number of different Black thinkers throughout history fell into this trap and viewed this as being a symptom of a declining Black experience, where if women are taking over these roles, it means that these families are experiencing serious oppression. But what that does is it just normalizes that there should be families, like nuclear families are normal, and that men should be the kind of patriarchal figure in those dynamics, which is a lot of assumptions. Like, there's nothing that actually says that should be the normal dynamic. Because firstly, the idea of the nuclear family is itself not a normal, neutral, natural phenomenon. You don't see that in nature. This is something that comes about through the confluence of various material and historical conditions to permit that possibility. I mean, and we developed a whole genre kind of expressing cultural anxieties about this creation, this construct. And this is like the story of the horror film and the haunted house. The haunted house is often a kind of genre that captures the anxieties of living in a nuclear family, which means being isolated from community, where you're trapped alone in a home that has no one around you. Like, we know we express these anxieties, and this shows that this is not a natural, normal setting. So a number of different thinkers, from Du Bois to Fraser, they fell into the trap of thinking that Black women taking on more authoritative roles within the nuclear family was a sign of racism. And it's like, yeah, okay, racism, of course, this is present, but women taking on these roles is not the consequence of that. Like, this could be a whole slew of different things, whether it's from older inspiration from different African contexts with matriarchal family settings or anything like that. It can be any number of things. So the mammy would be the good Black mother in white homes, whereas the matriarch is seen as the despotic, authoritarian, bad Black mother in Black homes. Now, another common stereotype is that of the welfare mother, who's depicted as a lazy person who doesn't want to work at all and who's just collecting welfare checks from the state and is just relying on that. And this person has acquired, and they would be the subject of a lot of people's anger, because white folks would be very mad about the fact that they would be working, and they believe that there are these people out there who don't have to work at all, who are just getting these checks from the government to and just exploiting the government's generosity. Now, of course, this is not true. This is not a well-documented phenomenon. If it is true, it's those white kids who get everything without having to work at all, because they just won the birth lottery of being born into a family with generational wealth. I mean, that is where the real affirmative action has always existed. That is where the real handouts have always existed. But they have not been subject to the kind of stereotype like that of the welfare mother, or the quote-unquote welfare queen, that was used to justify white anger among the working classes against Black women. But additionally, this image and this stereotype worked in a way as to sell the idea that Black women are not actually American people or part of the American nation, and therefore are undeserving of anything that comes out of the American federal government in the form of welfare checks. And this helped to consolidate and maintain the idea of the American nation as a white nation, where the social body is a white body. And there's also, finally, the stereotype of the quote-unquote Jezebel, or this is the Black woman who's this hypersexual Black woman who cannot be satisfied sexually and who's just endlessly pursuing men's attention to satisfy these sexual urges. And this helped to justify violence against women, the exploitation of women's bodies, enforced sex work that was not necessarily taken on by them through their own consent, through justifying like so many different kinds of violences against Black women. And of course, the idea that this would be an explanation for why Black women would have so many children, which is not itself any more than white people throughout most of American history, but it would take on different proportions, because if Black people are not seen as part of the very fabric of America, we see Elon Musk today really continuing this thread every time he does one of his tweets about declining birth rates among white people. He's repeating these white supremacist scripts, suggesting that the salvation of the nation is bound up with the salvation of its dominant race. And these are very problematic, scary, Nazi-like ideas, and they've long been used against Black people to foment anger, to cultivate anger against Black people and their reproduction. Now, Patricia Hill Collins is clear that these stereotypes, they don't just circulate among white people. She's very clear that Black men, too, contribute to these stereotypes and participate in them. And she uses the example of Two Live Crew as a rap group to call attention to their sexist lyrics. And for more of a discussion on that, I really recommend Trisha Rose's Black Noise. I've actually covered it on the channel, but again, I am no replacement for that book. That book is written so well, like it's so good, that looks at the history of rap and also interrogates the ways in which rap is like hyper scrutinized for being sexist, as it should be. I mean, like any genre, if it's sexist, it should be scrutinized. But Trisha Rose asks, like, why though? Like, why do we have then no problem with bands like the Beatles or Led Zeppelin or ABBA or whatever that had lyrics that were extremely sexist by men who were, in many cases, pedophile sexists? Like, how come black men and rap is getting all of this attention? And again, she's clear, like, if it's sexist, it should still be given that attention. But it's just a little suspicious how it's always them getting this kind of concern, whereas white people just seem to continually get a pass in these cases. Now, stereotypes such as these are only the tip of the racist and sexist iceberg. Even if a black woman or girl manages to somehow avoid being seen in these ways, she'll need to exist in a world that views black skin, black hair, black eyes as undesirable and unattractive. I mean, this is the story of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, which is a novel about, one of its plot points is a young black girl who like doesn't see herself as being beautiful because she doesn't have blue eyes. And this just goes to show the ways in which white supremacist beauty standards, like how your hair must be long and straight, how you should have blue eyes and white or pale skin. There's nothing more beautiful about any of these identity markers, yet they obtain this status within a white supremacist culture as being the markers of beauty. So even if black women are somehow able to not fall into any of these other stereotypes because they're perfect, like they fit into the hegemonic image of how they should exist, they would still need to navigate these unattainable, impossible beauty standards, which are just an extension of these racist ideas and sexist ideas. Now, of course, colorism, like this is also a very important part here, and this is something that affects women and really people across the globe, where lighter-skinned people in different contexts are relatively privileged to darker-skinned people, even if they aren't white. So this goes to show the pervasive colonial, globalized effects of white supremacy on the world and the appreciation of whiteness and white beauty markers as signs of true beauty. And yeah, okay, we're going to wrap that up here. Next time we're going to pick up with Chapter 5, The Power of Self-Definition, and we're going to cover from there till the end. But yeah, stay tuned. Hope you're all doing well, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.